So Woodland Hills started in 1992. I was a professor at Bethel University, and on occasion churches would call because they needed someone to fill in the pulpit. And I always liked to preach, and so I'd always say yes to that. And most of the churches that needed a professor to fill in while they were looking for a pastor or whatever were Baptist General Conference, which is the denomination that owns Bethel University. And some of those churches during that interim period kind of thrived. So the superintendent of the Baptist General Conference proposed to me that he says, well, what do you think about staying in one place and building a church around you? We're looking to plant a church in Woodbury, which at the time was one of the fastest growing suburbs in the United States.
We picked our name because Woodland Hills was the favorite in a door-to-door survey in the neighborhood. Now that we're in a pretty flat area with no woods, it's an odd name to say the least. But back in the day, we started off with a core of 40. When our doors opened on the first public Sunday at Battle Creek Middle School, over 300 people showed up.
And it grew from there. After the first year, we were around 600 or so. It was just explosive. It was passionate. The worship, we were really on fire.
Those early years were so great. They were passionate, we had worship that was amazing, it was fast-paced growth, and lots of enthusiasm, but it was insane. It was absolutely insane. We didn't have much structure, and there was really a disagreement about the overall vision for the direction. For example, within the first year, Greg really sensed that we should start being out of the suburbs and heading towards the city.
I just had the sense that we're not necessarily supposed to be in the city, but we're supposed to face it and have a heart for it, and to be sort of a bridge between the suburb and the city. I had all the good intentions in the world, but in 1992, and for some time after that, I was an ignorant white guy. I didn't have any real clear idea of what the meaning of whiteness was. It took being in relationship with people of color to really begin to open my eyes to the fact that the world that I live in, the America that I live in, is not necessarily the America that an African American or a Native American or Hispanic or Latino that they live in. I live in a little different world because America was established by white Europeans and for the sake of white Europeans, and so it's been run by white Europeans. And the result is that, on the whole, there's always exceptions, but white folks tend to live sort of in a zone of privilege where you get to kind of just move around without bumping into things. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that when Jesus died, he created one new humanity and tore down all the walls that divide us to make us one. And so then in Christ there's neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Gentile. And that means that racial reconciliation was one of the things Jesus died for as part of the atonement, which means that you can no more not preach reconciliation than you can decide to not preach forgiveness of sins. You know, they're on the same plane. We've been on a learning curve ever since, and we're still on it. But it's a beautiful one, it's a great one, it's a true one, and it's something that we're very, very invested in.
As our vision was clarified, we continued to grow. Those first few years were nuts, but we needed more space. And so we moved into a high school in St. Paul.
Early on, we had an incredible amount of passion and energy, but we still had unfinished bylaws, no mission, no vision statement, no statement of faith, and no clear organizational structure. Basically, none of the things you're supposed to have in place before you even start a church.
Because of all the growth we'd been experiencing, virtually all of us staff and our energy were put into the weekend services. Sundays coming was a phrase that drove everything. Nobody ever had time to get real foundation in place because we were working on Sundays.
In 1997, we established a steering team made up of some pastors and some volunteers. I was actually a volunteer on that 9-person team. And we began to think about how Woodland Hills should be structured.
We realized that we needed to transition from a weekend event into a Jesus-looking community of spiritually empowered people who impact our communities and the world in a Jesus-looking kind of way.
One of the jobs of the steering team was to define a church leadership structure. And they're the ones who came up with our overseers, trustees, our executive team, and our covenant partners.
So covenant partnership is what the steering team called our model of church membership.
A lot of us grew up with the idea of church membership, and for many of us, it was just sort of a rote thing that you kind of did. We wanted to have the idea of partnership, covenanting together. And so from the beginning, we hoped that our covenant partners would be folks who would be active, would be engaged in the core of our church.
One unique aspect of our church membership is that we renew our vows each year. We recognize that sometimes churches end up with membership lists that are bigger than reality simply because people never take themselves off.
So the steering team wanted to ensure that our covenant partners would be actively committed to the work our church is doing. And so those of us who want to continue, we re-up every year in May.
To become a covenant partner, people take our Discover the Kingdom class. That class is 13 weeks long, and we offer it a couple of times a year.
The steering team also established our overseer and trustee boards. Our overseers look after the big picture things like the mission, vision, and direction of the church. The board is made up of a mix of leadership staff and volunteer covenant partners, but our Constitution specifies that the majority should be volunteers.
The trustees are also a majority volunteer group of staff and covenant partners who provide oversight for the business operations of the church, things like finance, legal questions, and HR.
Most large churches are staff-driven instead of congregation-driven, and that's true of Woodland too. The trustees and overseers provide oversight, but they've tasked the staff to run the church, which starts with our executive team.
A lot of people assume, probably most people assume initially, that because I'm the senior pastor, this is kind of my gig. I run the show here. You must be the one who calls all the shots. The reality is, I don't call most of the shots here. I don't want to call most of the shots. I've got one virtue, and that is I'm very aware that I am not good at most things. I'm good at one or two things. I can read, and I can write, and I can talk. But when it comes to running things, that's just, when it comes to anything organizational, you don't want me in the finances, believe me. It's the first 2 weeks of my marriage with Shelley, we thought men are supposed to have the finances. That's what Bill Gothard said. And so I tried to run the finances for 2 weeks, and it was a disaster. I never think about money. I don't think about those kind of things. My wife thinks about it all the time. I'm just not very practical. So if this church depended on me to run it, we would be in deep trouble. In fact, there wouldn't be a we here anymore. We would have been gone a long time ago. In the Bible, they talk much more about teams. Paul writes to the elders at different churches in different locales. And even the Apostle Paul, although he was an apostle, he talks about a team that he's a part of, an apostolic team. And so we then evolved to a team model of leadership. You know, churches where you have a really hot shot, excellent, gifted leader, a leader who is cursed with the ability of being good at almost everything, those folks tend to then trust their own abilities and own ideas over other people's. And so the folks who come to work for them or work under them are really just their gophers and just carrying out that person's vision and never get to contribute anything of their own to the vision or have any feedback on that or whatever. And often those folks don't last very long because no one wants to be a cog in someone else's wheel. Whereas if you have this team concept, you have input from everybody. And I just think it's much wiser, it's much more biblical, and in the long run, it's more efficient. You don't get things done as quickly, not at all. We're much slower than a lot of churches, but I think in the long run, it's the better, more secure, wiser way of going about things.
Our executive team is made up of Greg, our senior pastor, Janice, our executive pastor, and Paul, our teaching pastor.
Greg does most of the preaching and teaching on the weekends and carries a good chunk of the theological vision for Woodland. Janice, she heads up our pastoral team, works with the staff to make sure the practical and spiritual goals we have for our church are backed up with solid plans and strategies.
Paul is part-time at Woodland and also works as a professor at Bethel. Paul was brought on because of our deep concern for solid theology, and he collaborates with Greg in shaping the theology of the church.
Having a team means that we also have a wider depth of gifts, and it means that we have multiple perspectives, different angles on things, from day-to-day practical issues to philosophical and theological ones. But we've always encouraged diverse opinions at Woodland Hills.
We think it's good to question. We don't think that doubt and faith are antithetical. Often questioning is how you grow in your faith. If what you're believing is true, then why would you have any fear of exposing it, of saying, let's look at it, let's examine it? Is this, if someone comes along with a different belief, the response shouldn't be, oh, let's beat them up, get them out of here, but rather, okay, let's check it out and weigh the evidence. I think people have the capacity to think. In fact, Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul. He includes mind there, with all your mind. The mind does one thing, it thinks. So we worship God by thinking. I think God wants us to think deeply about things. And you find that throughout the Bible. God doesn't just say, either believe it or I smite you. It says, come let us reason. Acts 1:8, it says that Jesus gave them many infallible proofs of his resurrection.
I've appreciated the fact that Greg invited me on board as a teaching pastor, knowing that he and I disagree on some theology. To help us out, we've often used a concentric circles diagram that helps us realize that at the center of our faith, at the center of everything is Jesus. Jesus' sacrifice, Jesus' love, Jesus' cross. His example should drive everything we do and tells us everything we need to know about God, ourselves, and each other. Outside of that are what we call dogmas of the faith. These are the things Christians have believed as essential forever. You might call them the pillars of Christianity. When you get to doctrine, which is where denominations can differ, now we're talking about more peripheral things. For example, everyone agrees that baptism and communion are important, but how you do them, exactly what they mean, these can be things that Christians in different churches can differ on. Finally, that last outside circle is opinion level beliefs. And here, even people amongst the same church or you with your senior pastor might disagree on these sorts of things. These are the things that Christians usually fight about, but aren't at all the center of our faith.
We try to present a variety of voices, and if you attend our Q&A sessions, you'll know that there's a diversity of opinion even among our pastors.
It's God who said, come, let us reason together. But we all try to make sense of this world and will inevitably end up disagreeing about peripheral issues. That's okay. We encourage people to think for themselves.